Good afternoon, and welcome to the Excite Center. My name is Youngmoo Kim. I'm the director of this center. Excite stands for Expressive and Creative Interaction Technologies. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you here and to host the inaugural Speakers Series event for the new College of Computing Informatics. I think that deserves a round of applause. Right? So I'm going to show a very 30-second video about the Excite Center.
Many have wondered whether innovating is more of an art than a science, or more of a science than an art. We believe that all things being equal is exactly where innovation thrives. The Excite Center at Drexel University, where creative expression and technology come together.
So as you can see, the Excite Center, the mission of the Excite Center is to foster highly multidisciplinary collaboration, and I think that ties in very well with the theme of today's event. So if you want to know more about the Excite Center, I'm certainly here. I'd love to talk to you afterwards, and certainly visit our website as well, drexel.edu/excite. So to formally kick things off, I'm going to hand off the microphone to a good friend and colleague who is now the Senior Associate Dean for the College of Computing for Research and Scholarly Activities. Please welcome Dr. William Regley.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. It's a pleasure to be here in your house, and thank you for letting us take over your living room. So I just wanted to give a couple words here. You're going to get an introduction to an introduction to an introduction. I'm number 2. So this is the inaugural seminar series for the College of Computing and Informatics. When this college reorganization came about over the summer, a couple of faculty approached us about, well, what are we doing for a seminar series this year? You know, can I invite speakers, and who should we be inviting, who's in charge? And we got a number of the faculty, Deborah being one of them, to say, look, why don't you think about what tone you want to set for this new organization? Because we have a unique opportunity here at Drexel, given the diversity of disciplines now under one roof, spanning everything from libraries to computer algorithms on the other side, to set a tone for what kind of personalities this unit is going to attract, and who we want to hold up as examples for the sort of output and work we do. So the team has nominated a number of luminary speakers. Of course, we have Dr. Lynch here today, and we have in a month Jimmy Wales, right? So Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia, otherwise known as Jimbo, I learned the other day. So he'll be here, and we're trying to make these talks something that is a resource not just to Drexel and our department, but to the region at large. And we're really thrilled to see the number of people who came from all around the region. I want to just acknowledge, I understand we have folks here from CCP, Jefferson, LaSalle, Pierce, St. Joe's, Temple, University of Penn, Westchester, folks from the libraries. All these organizations are here. Obviously, our head of libraries, Danuta Nateki, one of my closest colleagues over the last 2 years, trying to build digital repositories, is here. We have Trudy Hahn, past president of ACES, is here, right? One of our current faculty who works in our Washington, D.C. office. And we also have our colleagues from the Academy of Natural Science. Rick McCourt and his colleagues are here. So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah, and she's going to facilitate the discussion we're going to have today.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for coming. I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers and say that the format for the day will be them in conversation for about 45-50 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and answers until 2:30. And so I'll go ahead and introduce them now. Our speakers today are both distinguished in their own right. Systems expert Clifford Lynch leads the Coalition for Networked Information as its executive director and is adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a Ph.D. in computer science. We're especially appreciative that he is here today and not in Berkeley, co-teaching his Friday afternoon seminar on information access with Professor Michael Buckland. His accomplishments include service in numerous advisory capacities, including at the Library of Congress, the National Research Council, the National Academies Board on Research Data and Information, and more. Dean David Fenske, our Isaac L. Auerbach Professor and founding Dean of our new College of Computing and Informatics, has successfully overseen research initiatives as the National Science Foundation Center for Visual and Decision Informatics and the Applied Informatics Group. Prior, Dr. Fenske was a member of the Global Systems Integration Division at IBM and was involved with the design and deployment of a major digital library service while at Indiana University. I could easily say more about both of today's speakers. Instead, I'll share where this idea for a conversation format came from. Some of you, there was once a successful marketing campaign in which a pivotal element was silence. Perhaps some of you remember this series of television commercials in which chit-chat ended and people leaned forward expectantly, listening after hearing the words, "When E.F. Hutton talks."
Oh, yeah.
It's rare when an individual has this effect, and even more rare when someone has this impact in multiple disciplines. I first learned that Clifford Lynch is one of those rare individuals. While working as a librarian at the University of California multi-campus system, I witnessed many an initiative go absolutely nowhere until one of my librarian colleagues asked, "Well, what did Clifford say?" As the UC Director of Library Automation, he helped pave the way for what has since become the California Digital Library. Clifford can speak eloquently on so many topics, it proved challenging for the committee to figure out what to ask him to speak about. Likewise, some time ago, I first met David through talk, specifically an informal conference town hall meeting. It was there that
You remember that?
I remember that. I was a doctoral student. It was there that I first observed how engaged, informed, passionate, and well-read he is. Although we may know David as an administrator, a scholar, a mentor, and to some of his associate deans, I understand, a chain puller. Or a founding dean. He's here as an intellect, skilled at conversation to surface new ideas and new perspectives. We're lucky to have two equally distinguished individuals before us. Please join me in witnessing them in conversation.
Thank you. So Cliff, we've known each other, by my account, for about 20 years now.
Sounds about right.
Probably at least going back to my time at IBM when I was out in San Jose, and then maybe you remember something before that. So we've seen each other we see each other 5 times a year at various conferences and in various settings. And so I guess the first question I have to ask you, however, based on the day, the time, and the place, so close to Washington, D.C. as we are, and so involved as you are on inside the Beltway things. In the last year, I ran into you at the National Academies, on the board on data access and data preservation. So tell us a little bit about your point of view, maybe, about what is the cumulative effect here of the sequester and now the shutdown and maybe worse coming on some of the really important things, such as the National Academies and the data, the access to data issue.
That's a big question. Let me try and address a couple of pieces of that, and I'll try and do it without going on too long. First off, I should say that my organization, the Coalition for Networked Information, tends to try and stay out of the genuinely political and legislative arena. So, for example, there are organizations like the Association of Research Libraries, one of our sponsors, or the American Library Association, or EDUCAUSE, who have people who really directly interact with the legislative process, try and represent the views of the library community or the higher ed community in active legislation, things like copyright laws or things like that. My sense is that unless you're really doing that full time, you're not going to be very effective at it. So CNI, being a small organization with a lot of other things to do, tends to leave the leadership to in that particular area to others, although we stand ready and do try and help with the odd technical analysis or something like that. A lot of where we get involved is either earlier on, trying to think about what kind of fundamental principles might motivate a legislative or regulatory initiative, or after legislation has happened, trying to figure out how to implement it, how to conform to it, what it really means to cultural memory organizations and higher ed organizations on the ground. So that's kind of where we sit. And, you know, it's interesting to look at Washington because many people think of sort of partisan Washington, about the, you know, bickering that goes on the Hill and things like that. But there actually is, you know, genuinely a large core of activity in Washington that I would not characterize as fundamentally political. I mean, there are, you know, enormous numbers of people who are involved in stewardship of our cultural memory in various ways at organizations like the National Library, the National Library of Medicine, or the Library of Congress, at the Smithsonian. There are people at the major funding organizations like NIH, NSF, who, you know, are really about the progress of science and research and healthcare and things like that. And I deal a lot with that part of the world of Washington, you know, which really has been hammered in many ways. I mean, they're the sort of collateral damage from all of the sequesters and government shutdowns and things like that. And you know, really, in my view, you know, they deserve so much better than that. When I look at what's going on there, I think you can identify a number of trends that are interesting and exciting and quite powerful. One is this sort of macro trend to openness, the notion that the results of federally funded research, whether they be articles or whether they be data, get opened up to the public, that information resources and data resources that are created by government agencies in the course of their work be not only open to the public, but increasingly open to the public in friendly ways that facilitate reuse and recombination of that data. So I see a lot of thinking about that. It's quite striking how over the last decade the funding agencies have made the move to recognize that we're in an era of data-intensive scholarship and that they need to step up to helping us to recognize that through things like the introduction of data management plans as part of funding processes. I see a lot of exciting progress there. The kind of work that the Smithsonian has done, for example, under the current secretary there, is just amazing. They've made a really large-scale commitment to digitize and open up those collections, be they art collections or natural history collections, and this is a great thing for everybody. So I see some really, really important and positive trends like that happening. We certainly, you know, have seen some other things surface in the last year or two, particularly where, you know, clearly information intensive characterizes a lot of other government activities that are going on. And, you know, maybe we want to talk more about that later. I'll just maybe make two last remarks here. One is about the effects of the shutdown and the sequester, but especially the government shutdown. I've seen a couple of newspaper articles that sort of are pretty glib about this. They say it's a bit of an inconvenience. You can't go to the Washington Monument. The museums are closed. That it's really bad for the federal employees, but for the rest of us, it's kind of non-essential services. We are getting a very interesting little window here into the many, many ways in which we depend on the federal government and the resources it puts up as part of the sort of digital fabric. The ways it connects to scholarship and education and teaching and learning and healthcare and all of this. And I think it's quite fascinating to look at what's going on here. The directive that went out, curiously, to most government sites was not to just close the doors and hope that the computers stay up, but rather to deliberately shut all the computers down and just put up a sign saying, sorry, government's run out of money, the service will resume when the government comes back. So if you try and get, for example, to most of the services at the Library of Congress, you get that latter sign. Now, this is very interesting. If you go over to PubMed Central, where you have this great growing public repository of healthcare information, parts of that have actually been declared an essential service. Those people are still there. They're not ingesting new articles, but PubMed Central is up with a banner saying access is still available. Unfortunately, that's not the case with many of the other government sites. So I just invite you to kind of look at this and think about how important is continuity of access to various kinds of research data, much of which has been, suddenly disrupted here. What is this actually doing to science as it's conducted today, to research activities? And I think there's a very important postmortem to be done here because it measures a lot of sort of subtle, incremental, day-by-day shifts that have been taking place that don't really get brought into stark relief until there is this kind of a disruption.
Well, let me sort of respond back to at least a few of those points as best I'll remember them actually. So on the data access, Adi mentioned the president has issued at least 2 executive orders within the last year to release, further release vast amounts of publicly supported data. I remember talking to some advisors to the foundation board about a year ago when that was a likely outcome, and it was an interesting conversation because the conversation was about, well, if you I mean, it wouldn't take much to guess that these various agencies, even segments within the agencies, don't exactly have the same schemas. And they don't exactly have tools that interact with one another, and there's no knowledge mapping that goes on, or very rarely. And so for a lot of the sources that have been suddenly released, this conversation occurring before that was really about, well, was there the potential for a backlash in the sense that the public would expect, well, we have access to so much information, now I want to use it, what can I do with it? And then inside the community and inside our community, there was a conversation about, well, what is our role in this? And then I'm also a member of the National Consortium on Data Science down in North Carolina, basically at Renzi. And And the conversation there was largely about the same thing. How do we create the tools for publicly accessible information that can make the actual use and reuse of this information somehow useful or more useful than simply opening up the doors and saying, here it is. Then there's the whole issue of the curation of this data, something that several of my colleagues, Bill included, are very interested in. And the whole issue of the tools is one of the centers of our focus for the Center for Visual Decision Informatics. Data science, data-intensive computing, and all of its dimensions is for us a big deal. And in fact, it's one of the reasons for that for that now famous chart that many of you have seen that created this new college. So public access to information is good, I think we would agree. But it's going to be a good to the extent that the new knowledge that we think can be created from reuse and simply the tools to necessarily understand it can be created at a pace equal to the public's expectation of value, and value is a key word, from the simple act of access to information. And so I guess I would, if we can just maybe follow, and I'm also referencing the work that you've done at the National Academies regarding access to the primary data that is the source for much of the scholarly literature of science. I'm curious now to see how have our expectations, the public's expectations, society's expectations, been raised, and what is our sense as a community, and I don't just mean our college or Drexel University, but more broadly, as a community, really to rise to that level where we can create, so NCDS has been talking about data observatories and data laboratories, where in fact you actually have big data. You know, one of the oddities about big data is that you talk about big data, and who has big data? Well, if you think you have a lot of data, you have big data. That's the definition of it. Yeah. But truly big data presents some real challenging problems. And so creating the repositories, the views of big data, and then the tools that actually deal with that is, I think, one of our national challenges. And I'd like to have you comment on that.
I think that's an incredible challenge and an incredible opportunity at the same time. And, you know, I think that the kind of multidisciplinary organizations like this new college are very well positioned to respond to many of the opportunities here. I think that there are a couple things that need to be said here. One is that there is a tremendous gap between making raw data available, which many of the agencies have been doing to some extent for 20 years. Think of the U.S. Geological Survey, for example, which really was quite open with its data for a long time, or NOAA. Right. And turning that into something that various sectors can use, and I'll come back to that sectors in a minute. There's also a huge spectrum of potential users. I mean, it's not just one sector. I think there's a very interesting tale to be told, for example, if you look at what's happened in so-called geographical information systems, GIS. 20 years ago, that used to be a kind of a specialized niche. There were GIS experts that were part of IT or library organizations on many campuses that helped faculty and students work with GIS data. But it was a very specialized kind of field. The tools were quite hard to use. And then you saw a series of breakthroughs, notably Google Maps and related things, that they didn't solve all the problems there, and they don't do everything that the high-end research community needs, but they opened up geospatial data, at least some classes of it, for use by an enormously larger swath of the public.
Agreed.
And I think, we can see those kinds of opportunities showing up. I mean, another, perhaps less critical one in some sense, because GIS data really is very critical to a large number of social processes, is what's happened with the sky surveys. Jim Gray and his colleagues, back a few years ago, working with Tony Hay at Microsoft
Right.
Research and all
He
that.
was here last year.
Yes, built that wonderful, virtual observatory idea, which, that wasn't just for astronomers. That was for every school kid who's interested in looking at stars and can't see them very good because they live in a city or they don't have a telescope.
Right.
Just fabulous idea in terms of really opening up data to the public. And we have challenges all along that range. We also have some very specific social challenges. I mean, one that's quite striking to me is the so-called translational medicine initiatives that the National Institutes of Health are sinking so much money and energy into. The basic, challenge that they perceive is that there is an enormous, almost unbridgeable gap between what happens in the lab and how this moves into delivered health care at scale. And in particular, how you make any transitions there in less time than the generational lifespan of physicians, since most of them don't seem to pick things up just like other folks after they graduate from school. This is in very real sense a sort of a data reuse challenge, among other
Huge
things.
one.
There are other deep problems there that are social and economic, but it embeds in it a very, very substantial data reuse challenge, actually going in both directions. It's not just how you get the stuff from the lab out into the field. It's how you discover that these things that look good in the lab actually have side effects and interactions that maybe you need to cycle back into the research process.
Right. So let me play off that for a moment. I was at a conference within the last year on moving genomic data from research to clinical practice. And it was a fascinating conference. For all the 20 years of very heavy funding by the NIH, we still are only in very specific and relatively small areas close to clinical practice. UPenn is probably one of the leaders here. To clinical practice, to clinical applications in the real world. And part of that is simply data. At what point do you have enough DNA data to know from what demographic areas that you're able to know that something is usual or unusual or rare or idiosyncratic to one ethnic or demographic group or so on. And the truth is we have millions and millions of data points, but we still don't know that they are statistically valid. But the other part, and I'm noticing one of my colleagues back there, who's Shane, I also poll regularly, and she's a good sport about it. But it came up that a lot of people, about 10 million of them, have donated anonymous their own DNA to public databases, anonymized. So this notion of privacy and of donating your DNA not because you expect necessarily to get something out of it, but because there's a public good to building the database. And yes, if the database got large enough, you might get some return from it. That's a very powerful public policy issue. But so one of the computer scientists from MIT at this conference came along, very, very bright young man, and came along and took the anonymized data and broke the code. and re-anonymized the information based on what he could see, and with the 85% accuracy rate. And he confirmed it by actually contacting the people involved to find out whether or not he had gotten it right. And it deals with, I think, a very important issue here. We anonymize to theoretically protect privacy, but that also has some penalties on the research end, for sure, and what you can do, what you can figure out. There was another person at this conference that really got at this issue in a completely different way that I really hadn't thought about, except back in my days with copyright and open licensing. And his approach was, and we can't, we probably cannot ultimately anonymize something so far that is truly anonymized and still have it be a research value. And you know, that's a very difficult a kind of conversation. Or another way of saying it is that privacy may be always a casualty at some point in the interest of some level of even public good. That's an interesting question. And hotly debated. But the very fact that you can do that. So I think we talked about him, John Wilburn?
John Wilbanks, I believe is who you're thinking
He gave
of.
a really interesting talk on consent. Rather than talking about anonymization, he actually talks about consenting to use your data in certain ways, and you can consent. You're not trying to hide your identity. You're simply saying you can use it this way, but not that way. It's a very involved, very complicated process. But the appeal is the same. The appeal is to the public good. You should donate your DNA data, not only because someday, maybe you or your children, or your children's children will see the results of it, but because we build the kind of medical health care that at some point serves us all. In his view, consent was a more likely course towards that goal than debating at some more length the issues of privacy, which may be unobtainable.
Gosh, there's so many places I want to go following that on.
It's meant to be a little provocative.
I think I want to go three places here.
Okay.
One is first to just attach a couple of footnotes. 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, the Academies Board on Research Data and Information did a public symposium on privacy in the big data world, and the webcast from that should be up, linked to the Board on Data and Research Information site. John Wilbanks actually spoke at that and gave an excellent summary of some of the work he'd been doing. There's probably other video of him around the web, but if you'd like to delve into that in a little more detail, he has probably done, in my view, the most thoughtful and innovative work on trying to deal with some of the interactions between privacy, the mandates for informed consent in human subjects research settings, and anonymization, particularly in the context of things like personalized medicine. So if you're interested in this, that's worth following up. Second set of comments, and I sort of feel like I should precede this. You know how back 10 years, 15 years ago now, it used to be commonplace when one was talking about public policy things related to the internet to preface one's remarks by saying, I'm not a lawyer, you know, although I may play one in certain settings. Yeah. I now am starting to feel like I need to, you know, preface things with, I am not a molecular biologist, you know, and I've read just enough about it to be dangerous and really confused. But I think that, if anything, we really are underestimating the level of statistical and informatics challenges that are in front of us, because our understanding and our data sources are both exploding. You know, there's been so much talk of gene sequencing. There's actually very little gene sequencing going on today. What's actually going on is genotyping, where they look at some specific well-characterized variations or variations of interest.
And the phenotype issue is
yeah.
particularly controversial in that.
Yes, but so they're just selecting a few specific data points. Meanwhile, the cost of whole-scale sequencing is on you know, a plummet that makes Moore's law look you know, pretty mild. So
$1,000 is a reasonable goal?
they're probably going to be there in the next few years.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you're going to get a whole lot more data, and it's going to be data that is much more characteristic of, let's just collect it all and then we'll statistically sort it out, rather than we'll do this kind of partially guided process based on things that we think we understand about biological processes. At the same time, the understanding of what constitutes significant data is shifting all over the place. So if you look, you know, at some of the big initiatives, used to be they thought that there were these genes and then there was this stuff they called junk DNA, and that most of it was junk. And now the junk isn't looking so junky.
Yeah.
They are also interested not just in, you know, sort of static expression, but understanding how this varies from place to place in your body, and it's turning out all this nearly as tidy as, you know, many people would like to think. So the flood of data that's going to come in here, particularly when you think about combining it with the move to electronic health records, is astounding. The electronic health record thing is going to turn out to be a matter of a very interesting matter of national policy, by the way. You know, just as a sort of a sideshow, I'll note that in the U.S., to the extent that these records exist and are clean enough to be usable, they're sort of siloed into pools in various healthcare organizations and hospitals, and you know, your relationship to your own electronic health records is pretty ambiguous and dubious, and you know, that's a interesting emergent debate. But the bottom line is, at least right now, pragmatically speaking, the notion of saying, I want to do an analysis of the US population to try and understand something isn't very practical.
No.
Although various large healthcare operations are starting to do this on their internal pools as competitive advantage against other ones. Compare this, and I realize I'm idealizing things here a little bit, with the UK, where they have a nationalized health service that comes with a kind of crummy right now, but nonetheless, you know, at least in theory, centralized electronic health record system. And you actually see in the UK the government setting policy that says the national health record, that corpus, is going to be open for research, and the default is you're in it unless you opt out. And that we're going to not only do, you know, academic research here, we may open this up for mining by drug companies in exchange for the National Health Service getting a better deal on, you know, the national purchase of a given high volume drug or something. You're actually going to see this play into national policy in some absolutely fascinating ways. The last place, before I get off that, I also want to just pick up, I had the privilege of talking with a number of graduate students here before we did this dialogue, and one of the things we talked a little bit about was an example of this. We have also, and this is I think a little under-recognized right now, created through the ability to do sequencing a new observational device, which is going to have huge impact through the ability to capture these microbiomes. You know, we really know very little about the bacterial population of the biosphere and how that's distributed, whether it's attached to, you know, human skin or seawater or what, how it moves, how it varies geographically and in other ways. And we're starting through the combination of very intense computing off of these, you know, segments
It's
of
all data.
genomes. Yes. And sequencing technology. We've developed this, we're starting to develop this amazing new observational device, which is going to have impacts, you know, way beyond the sort of traditional medical sphere, and I think is going to, you know, take us just some fascinating places. Last thing I just want to circle back on is the anonymization thing. This is a great challenge for our time, and you know, what we're seeing is that anonymization doesn't work in many settings, or it doesn't work very well. That maybe we need to move to legal regimes that emphasize, on the one hand, consent, and on the other hand, protecting people by not by saying your data is secret, but by saying we're going to really do unpleasant things legally to people who abuse your data in various ways. You can see little, you know, some beginning of this, for example, in the discussion about excluding people from insurance because of, you know, examining genetic predisposition to various things. It's clear that you can do some things if you're very careful and very lucky with anonymization in certain kinds of aggregating environments, although there again it's tricky, you know, the queries that isolate out individuals out of big statistical collections, hard computer science and statistics problem over the last few decades. But really understanding this is absolutely critical. We have this whole promise of data reuse and data recombination as a way of, you know, accelerating and advancing scholarship, but we don't have a handle on the rules of the game here when that data involves personally identifiable information.
So just to maybe explore that at the risk of being quite provocative, I mean, so we have HIPAA. So how many people here have actually read HIPAA? Okay, good.
The whole act and the regulations?
So I mean, HIPAA is really more a protocol and a series of admonitions, and it's 20 years old. Some admonitions more recent than that, but basically its core is 20 years old. It's had some very interesting effects because it's interpreted differently by different institutions with different degrees of rigor. Basically, generally speaking, if you want to anonymize HIPAA data, you lose 19 fields. That's about
it has a very precise technical definition in there. Yeah.
So, of course, the only problem with that is what if you actually find a best practice later on as a result of data analysis? Well, getting back to the individual is not so terribly easy. And the legal consequences, so here, get into the issue. The consequences for having HIPAA data on your laptop when you lost it on the train and it wasn't properly secured can get up to $10 million. You know, it's very, 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 and it happens. It actually happened in Philadelphia 3 times in the last 2 years. I'm not going to say where and who. But it's a reality. The penalties are very, very high. and probably the act is more one of carelessness than of anything else. So I mean, we have to come back to the notion of what is the person's rights here, and what is the public good? And I think these are the polarities of these issues: anonymization, privacy protection, research. Because ultimately, anonymization and privacy protection costs something in terms of your ability to do research. And nowhere do you see that more evident than in the electronic medical record. So adoption rates have been varying. The quality of the data in the electronic medical record is often quite varying, and that's because it's regarded as IP by individual health systems. Aggregating it is hard, and then you have to ask yourself the real question. One of the two results we wanted wasn't just more cost-effective reimbursement, which we're sort of getting, but evidence-based medicine. And how close are we actually getting to evidence-based medicine, and what really is preventing that? And I'm not so sure we're much closer to evidence-based medicine, except for PubMed. We're much closer to evidence-based medicine because of the electronic medical record than we were 3 or 4 years ago. So maybe that's a takeoff point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it in even another direction, which is one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on over the past few years is a collection of issues around what's sometimes called personal digital archiving, or digital lives is another kind of placeholder for it. But it's really this question about how so much of the records and activities and thinking of individuals is now tied up in digital form, and some of it actually is alienated from people in various ways, where it's held under the control of other institutions or organizations. Some of it's very ephemeral, it's hard to amass. Health records obviously are a part of this, this very complex situation. And one kind of particular nexus point that is helpful in understanding some of the issues here is what happens when someone dies. And you need to kind of collect up the record of their lives.
There's a real curation issue, right?
Yes. You may want to transfer it to a memory organization if there are, why you'd want to transfer it and under what criteria are very interesting. Right. But what happens with medical records for dead people? Now, in terms of...
It's the new genealogy.
Is it? Or is this actually an asset that you can go out and market, or is it a public good? Yeah. Because when you're talking about doing this kind of large-scale data mining, if you've got a good sequence and a good medical record, doesn't really matter very much whether they're alive or not. You want to really, hit an ambiguous area, try and sort out who gets control of dead people's medical records. I mean, I've just poked in this morass casually, and the only thing I'll say about it is a morass, and it's not just HIPAA. HIPAA differs in many cases to state law on the matter. It's just delightful. Yeah. But I think this is one of these many examples of where you kind of crystallize out what's the public interest in this, what's the private interest, what's the privacy interest, and it really starts getting very complex.
Yeah, so it's not all is lost. I do see some good signs of the beginning of exchanges of electronic medical records between otherwise competing health systems. So we do finally see some progress there, and so it isn't that all is doom and gloom. But I think I do think we're challenged still on the issue of how close we are to evidence-based medicine in any kind of effective sense at the clinician level. Although I'll defer to my doctor colleagues to argue that point. So I don't know. I see Deborah standing up back there, and she's sending us 5 minutes. Okay. So
Wow, that went fast.
That did, didn't it? And the trouble is, we can keep on doing this. It's kind of an absurd limitation, isn't it? So I'll sort of, as a conclusion of my contributions here, say that I frequently get asked regarding this new college, which is now officially like 3 months old. Why we did it and so on. And of course, there are 2 answers to that. One is the internal Drexel University answer, and the answer is because the task force underneath the PAR process recommended it. And so we're trying to do that, and I really like our progress. Well, that's one answer. But I think the more important answer, frankly, lies outside the university and outside of our insular sense of ourselves. And really gets at the heart of this. Think back in just the last decade, a relatively small moment in time, right? Last decade. The impacts of ubiquitous computing and ubiquitous information. And I don't mean to imply by that it's all good. I don't necessarily know that it is. Some of it's quite ephemeral. I mean, how many people in this room have a smartphone older than 3 years? Got one. So it's quite ephemeral, right? And information itself is subject to, we have more of it beyond question. Do we have better information? Well, possibly, if we can figure out what it is and whether or not it matches our view of being true. A whole other set of questions. And then we have all these access issues still, even in the United States. You take a look at the impact of broadband across the United States, it's still very, very spotty. It's embarrassingly spotty.
That would be a good word.
And then if you take a look at this, globally, and then you try to talk about our national aspirations about Jeffersonian democracy and about an informed population, and you can see that we have enormous challenges in that. So for me, the reason this college was formed up was because, frankly, a society has gotten to a point where we have to look at these issues, which are essentially multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary issues. And while these issues may be built on the foundational pillars of computer science and information science, it's the areas in between that are the ones that I think have become very important and important to our conversation today. Certainly, in my opinion, enormously important for the next generation. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I think you can readily identify a whole set of things that are, major societal level issues that have been explored certainly from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, but where it's been very difficult to gain traction that's concomitant with the importance of the problem. I mean, one that I think is on on many people's minds is what you might call cybersecurity writ large.
Yeah.
You know, certainly computer science has had a thread through it
Yep.
that's, you know, the study of security and things like that. There have been, you know, people who've worked the sort of political aspects and legal aspects of this as a separate thread, and, you know, put privacy into the equation in there. There's a, you know, a sort of a thing that sits at the juncture of mathematics and computer science around actual cryptographic methods
Right.
and things. But when you really look at this problem at scale, it's a problem that goes very deeply into individual and organizational
Humans.
behavior. Yes, humans, both singly and en masse.
Yes.
You can, I think, as we're starting to understand better and better, find a whole series of issues about correctness, misinformation,
Disinformation.
reputation, all very much tied up in this. I just don't think the way our disciplines have been organized and siloed have been terrifically effective at dealing with this. Yet, you know, you start looking at the economic and national security and other kinds of implications of our failures in this area, and they're getting really serious.
Very, very serious. I think I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think we both agree about that. And even more importantly, Deborah is lurking over your shoulder.
Oh, okay.
I am, thank you. As you can see, our speakers can touch on a number of different topics. I'm sure our appetites are certainly whetted. And a number of you have questions. I have a mic. Miku has a mic on the other side of the room. Who would like to start with our questions?
Sure.
Thanks. Well, I was, of course, delighted and interested and fascinated by the proportion of time that we spent talking about healthcare. And certainly I could go in many different directions, but I just wanted to make what I think is an important point about evidence-based medicine. It certainly is a goal that we all share, both as providers and interested parties and as patients. But I think there's a human side to evidence-based medicine. There's a whole thread in the literature that points out the dilemma of why does evidence-based medicine, why does it not gain traction? And of a lot of it, I think, goes back to what one of you mentioned, and I'm sorry I can't attribute it correctly, but it's how we were trained, how providers were trained, and how do people change their habits. So there is another theory, which I think many of us in this room are familiar with, called diffusion of innovation. And that's really, I think, something that's very important. We can't lose sight of that. Yes, there are data issues. Yes, there are a lot of other issues, political and economic, but it does really boil down to the human side of what practitioners are willing to do, how are they going to have the resources to learn how to do things differently, and how are we going to incentivize that behavior.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, your presentation was always interesting and sometimes exciting. I really enjoyed it. So you talked about occasionally big data and cyber. And some of my clients are very involved in big data, and I see the enormous destruction that happens when there's a data breach to the institution's reputation, and also to those whose data is lost. So my question is, if you're looking at some of the issues about, let's take healthcare issues and PII and things like that, I understand as researchers you'd like to have that information be fully available so you can really have a big picture, bigger sample sets and everything else. But we're already seeing cases right now, but every time a database is sliced and diced, and there's always the case, the fact is there's no such thing as any data that's safe. Every single database is hackable.
I agree with you.
And and being in that field, every single perpetrator right now is no longer a couple kids in a college dorm room. It's major criminal enterprises who are way ahead of the good guys, and the good guys are almost only responding. But we're already seeing cases now where there's extortion and blackmail against those whose personal information in healthcare, I'll just stick with that topic, have been compromised. And now they're not just looking for money, not just looking to damage them and take their pretext that they're them and get some other health care or get a loan, but they're actually blackmailing individuals right now in extortion. How do we balance that? Because a federal database of healthcare information and slice and dice by contractors who have it, every single time that happens, there's one more lost laptop or one more place where somebody's got a security flaw and it's gone. How do we balance protecting the individuals knowing that we can't protect the data with having the access to big data and having the chance to really research it?
So I'll take the first crack at that. So my mother was a hard person about these kinds of things because she always talked in contrasts. So she would say, look before you leap, but hesitate and all is lost. Look before you leap, but hesitate and all is lost. And there's truth in that, of course, and in that juxtaposition as there is in your case. So one of the things I say when I'm being very provocative in public is if you have something I want, if I have the compute power to do it that I can sort of keep under the radar and the knowledge to do it, I'll get it, and you can't stop me. That's you can take that as a challenge if you want, and maybe I'll respond to that as a challenge. But the truth is that even upstairs here, we talk about building attack and defend cyber labs. And why do we do that? Well, in the 1950s, you talked about intelligence from a military perspective, perhaps a military intelligence, and you always talked about counterintelligence at the same time. When engineers invented a new weapon, they almost always invented the counter to that weapon within the next year. We are involved in a very serious game, but it's a game. It's a game involving a great deal of money and a lot of collateral damage. I don't use that term lightly. But there are people just as smart as we are, and smarter, and better funded. You can call them generally the bad guys, but their view of life may not be that they are the bad guys. They just happen to be some other country's nationals. All right? They view us as the bad guys. So what we don't have internationally now is anything that approaches the Geneva Convention. Not that that was very effective either, but anything that approaches the Geneva Convention regarding cyber warfare, and that's really what we're talking about. That's a kind of, I didn't really answer your question, but I maybe elaborated it some. Cliff?
I was so glad when you said you'd go first, because this is actually a really hard question to answer, and I don't have a great answer for it. But I'd just throw out a couple of thoughts. Specifically around the issues of extortion and things of that nature. One of the things that maybe this makes us think about long-term on a social basis is what secrets do we keep and why?
Yes.
It's
harder to protect a lot than a little bit.
You think about that both on an individual basis and on a organizational or a national basis. And you know, when we think about secrets, I mean, we're very, we throw a lot of things together there. There are secrets that are, you know, sort of tactical things about access, right? You know, my PIN number on my bank account. There are secrets that deal with norms of behavior. You know, just think about the, you know, hideous history of sexual orientation over the last century as a basis for various kinds of blackmail and extortion, because that was, you know, that was a social norm, and it was a huge secret that people had, and you know, a terrifically vulnerable point. And now I would say, well, you know, that's far from over and settled. It is certainly less of a point now. You know, it used to be that just having that secret, you know, disqualified you from many jobs that had a
McCarthy
security
era.
dimension to it. So I think that, you know, over time there will be more thinking about some of that, and particularly in an era where people realize that it is harder and harder to keep secrets, and you know, someone you know, one or two steps away has, you know, had their secrets revealed and had to deal with it. There'll perhaps be a greater tolerance around that. So that's one set of things that pop up for me. Another is that, and maybe it's related and it also connects to some of the things you said, is that particularly on an organizational, on a nation-state basis, we're doing things in public that, you know, used to happen in private and would only surface a little bit in public. I mean, your classic example of this is, you know, various kinds of espionage and whistleblowing kinds of things where, you know, it would surface a little bit in the papers as people off the record talked about things. Now you have, you know, spectacles like WikiLeaks,
Right.
which, you know, actually is a kind of an amazing recalibration of nation-state secret keeping that I don't think we've fully you know, absorbed the implications of yet. You know, we're gonna see, and you're seeing an intermix of nation-state and corporate information showing up in these things in a very funny way too. Imagine what's going to start happening if we're not there already when, you know, explicit disinformation is injected into these things by various players. This is going to get to be a very interesting world.
So, Cliff, we should maybe, that little conversation we had off stage about Snowden, and you made a really interesting point at the end, which is whose agent is he? Which I really hadn't thought about before. You know, if you start with the scenario that maybe he's a U.S. agent, it kind of leads you to some pretty different ideas about what he's done and why it was done than if you start out from another place. And you know, it may take us 20 or 30 years to know that.
If ever.
If ever.
If ever.
I just want to step in and say this has been a great conversation, but there's one area that you haven't touched on, and I thought I would just...
Only one?
Only one. Several, but just a recent publication of Cliff that you contributed to, Joe Janes edited this volume.
Oh.
Library 2020. It's a volume that's asking a number of experts in various sort of areas of libraries, public libraries, to think about the year 2020 and whether or not public libraries will exist and how. And in your entry in it, you talk about public libraries, and then you talk a little bit about academic libraries. And I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit for academic libraries as well for education, in terms of what should institutions be doing to prepare the institutions now in order to serve and prepare for this vision of 2020 that you imagined in creating that addition to that volume.
Yipes.
You
want to take the...
No, I'll be second on this one.
So when Joe asked me, Joe Janes did this volume where he went round and persuaded a number of people to write brief essays, and he said brief as one of the persuasive devices here, about their view of the library, what the library will look like in 2020, which is one of these kind of nasty time frames, because it's not, you know, far away enough to kick it off to, you know, serious speculation, but it's also not immediate enough that you're just, extrapolating super short-term trends. And I decided that it would be fun to write about something that I really have very limited knowledge of at some level, which was the future of the public library specifically. I actually live in a world where, while I think about the sort of structural functions of public libraries, I actually, have pretty darn limited direct interaction with them. And, I was raised warped anyway because I grew up in Manhattan, and, I had
There's a public library
I had
there.
this public
Yeah.
library there that was, well, it was what it was. It was
Yeah.
a magnificent
Yeah.
institution, but I gather not the same experience that other people had with their public libraries growing up, at least as I've compared notes with folks, as I've gotten outside Manhattan in my later life. It seems to me, that one of the really pivotal issues, and I actually see a huge divide showing up between the issues that face public libraries and those that face research libraries. I really see an enormous split there. But a lot of the issues around public libraries are that one of their primary roles, which was to act as essentially a sharing device for information and cultural materials across the society, to sit between a commercial marketplace and a sort of a social sphere, is being, just sort of viciously subverted by the move to ebooks and the licensing control that's extended there. That, in fact, what's happening at a certain level is that they're getting forced out of that market by commercial decisions that are being made by rights holders in a specific sector. And for all of the nice talk about how they love libraries and all of that, if you just unfortunately look at the evidence on the ground, it's not a real pretty picture. There's a report that one of the major library systems puts out that you can see through ALA every month, where basically they take I think it's the New York Times and the USA Today bestseller lists, and they just go through them once a month and they say, how much of this could we get in electronic form as a library, and what would it cost us? And the numbers there are really quite scary. So this suggests that you've got a big displacement happening there on one side, which is going to have some social consequences that we're really not going to like, I think. And it's kind of funny because we can stall a lot of them for a while, because right now there is very little, I would say, that's genuinely critical, that's coming out only in electronic form for much of the general public in books. There are a few things, but it's still a relative rarity. They can take the PR hit as libraries for being behind the times and say, well, we can loan it to you in paper. We can't put it on your Kindle, but we can loan it to you on paper. Sooner or later, we're going to hit a flashpoint. And actually, I'm reckoning it somewhere, between 2020 and 2030, where some significant things start showing up e-only. And then you're going to have a real, sort of fundamental social breakdown there. So that's the bad news part of that chapter. The good news part of that chapter is that I think that you have a whole new move where libraries, and particularly public libraries, have the opportunity to reposition themselves with respect to a lot of cultural memory, a lot of new kinds of cultural and scholarly production. And at least some of them are going to move into these areas in really genuinely kind of amazing ways. And that is going to create a whole new series of opportunities. And I think, you know, you can already see little pieces of it in some of the conversations around digital lives and around, you know, the sort of the generative nature of the internet and the way that's being exploited in many ways. There are very powerful connections here to ideas like maker spaces. So it's a you know, quite a mixed story, I would say, but those are a couple of the specific things I tried to think about there. And of course, you know, as I say, I write this from, you know, the sort of perspective of enormous ignorance that allows me to speculate more freely than some that are more deeply involved and knowledgeable.
Yes, thank you. David, I heard you peep up a little bit at the word reposition. Yes.
So I don't disagree with anything that Cliff has said, but maybe I will elaborate in a somewhat different direction. I think libraries are going to have to rethink themselves for sure, and they're going to have to be less about libraries as institutions and about librarians less as professionals, and much more about the notion of the actually quite traditional role of librarians as information intermediaries, and to focus on users, not the institution. So what does that mean translated into anything that you might think about? And maybe I'm on 2030 right now. But this is actually going to depend on a whole lot of really interesting research we're doing about, you know, how do we understand human cognition in ways that are essentially machine learning and artificial intelligence enhanced, and then what is the role of an information intermediary, machine, human, or both, in engaging that world? Yesterday we had a really interesting presentation by somebody who has some fabulous research in HCI, where, and admittedly this was really for military purposes, but we can imagine it for others, about a patch, like a Band-Aid, that you would wear that has 9 sensors on it, and it senses how you're reacting to the environment. You can see that, boy, that's pretty invasive. Or, boy, if we really knew that, we could figure out whether or not somebody was actually learning something, or somebody was actually engaging in the information they were helping to present. And maybe it would be a great, by the way, the target price for this patch is $10. You know, maybe it would be really great if we got to a place where wearing a patch like that was a social norm. It clearly wouldn't be now, but that was a social norm, and so that you have this augmented sense of human learning and human capacity, because that's really what it's about. And if you're talking about augmented human capacity, and you really reposition libraries, I think there's a really powerful role there, as long as we move away from a bricks and mortar concept.
See, it's interesting because there's kind of a schizophrenic issue here.
Several.
On the one hand, you know, there's a whole transformation in the way people discover information, how they use it, how they assess it and organize it, how they author it for those environments. So you can see, you know, those discussions going on, and you know, at the sort of far reaches of those are the kind of really fundamental questions you're raising about things like how do we learn, how do we measure learning, the neuroscience of learning, the neuroscience of perception. I mean, there's been some work recently, you know, the last 10 years that's really interesting on just, you know, how do we read? I mean, how do
we actually
you know,
process what we're
visual
looking at?
and cognitive systems
Yeah.
work to read language? So there's this stuff that's very transformative, and you know, nobody's quite sure where it takes us in the end, because we're just starting to understand some of the basic processes. At the same time, there's this enormous challenge which really falls to the cultural memory organizations, and that, in my mind, you know, absolutely includes the research library community,
Agreed.
the national libraries, and some other institutions, about how we manage this, you know, enormous cultural record that we're continually contributing to, and the nature of which is morphing in you know, strange and unpredictable
But that's
ways.
just the data residuals.
Yeah, but we got to work both of these kinds of issues at the same time. So, you know, it's easy enough to say more and more information is moving electronic, and maybe we need less brick and mortar buildings, or we need different kinds of brick and mortar buildings. But the sort of fundamental idea of collection building, of curation and preservation, you know, that side of libraries as cultural memory organizations is one that I absolutely, you know, feel that we must not lose sight of, and indeed there's real urgency in dealing with problems that are happening in that sphere.
I couldn't agree more. And but I also meant seriously what I said about what I call data residuals, because that's data curation. And to the extent that the world is becoming increasingly digital, that is going to be the memory is in fact going to be a digital memory, and already largely is. Deborah's lurking again.
I have a bad angle on Deborah here. Just the way the seat was positioned.
Yes. I just want to ask for questions one last time before I give both of you a couple of minutes to have a final statement to today's conversation. Yes.
Thanks for all the really insightful comments and remarks and thoughts. We touched upon this, I think, Dr. Lynch, about the multidisciplinary nature of the disciplines of computing and information science now, and I think it's relevant, particularly now with the formation of our new college. Obviously, most of the users of computing devices are not experts in computing anymore. And of course, we are teaching our students, you know, the ones who have self-selected with an interest in this, to the best of our abilities. But of course, there's a much broader audience, both at academic institutions and the public at large as well. And I guess I'd love to hear your comments. First, maybe you, Dr. Lynch, and then Dean Fenske, if you have comments as well. You know, what's the role of, I mean, academics, researchers, you know, practitioners of computing in disseminating that inference, that sort of digital literacy component to a much broader audience? Since we're all of us are impacted by the rapid pace of technological change.
I'm so glad you're going first.
I guess this is actually a little bit of a long-standing hobby horse of mine. There really are a couple of issues here. One is a set of literacies around information. And that's not a new problem. It's a problem that's taken on some new dimensions and aspects in recent years, and perhaps a greater sense of urgency for various reasons. But there's a set of issues there. there's a set of issues around technology literacy with a sort of a specific focus, but not an exclusive focus on information technology literacy. You know, as a nation, we're just monumentally and disastrously bad about that. If you just talk to people of, you know, all ages and all backgrounds about sort of, you know, fundamental sort of basic things, you know, why doesn't your cell phone work in some places? How does GPS work? How do radios work? You know, just really basic things. How does a search engine work? Not, you know, in huge detail and what are the algorithms, but just at a very gross level, what does it do? People don't know this stuff. And, you know, my personal view is that we need to start on a lot of this way before we get to college or to graduate programs. I mean, this is a huge hole in, you know, fundamental basic education for everybody. There's a piece of it, there are pieces of, you know, sort of basic K through 12 education that I think of as, you know, sort of survival skills, and these are a part of it, along with some other basic kind of, you know, navigating life sorts of things. We don't do these, as far as I can tell. And it's particularly nasty because there's no slot for them, right? You know, there are people who do physics and biology and history and language studies who all are making the case for their discipline. These are inherently transdisciplinary kinds of looks at things. So I think that's the first and you know, most fundamental problem, and unfortunately a lot of what we do at the at the college and the graduate level here is remediation. We shouldn't have to be doing this remediation, but it's you know, it's necessary, and we do what we can with it.
So my take on this is and there's nothing Cliff said I would disagree with in any way. Maybe I would take a different historical context. So how many people here think they would have been able to vote underneath the administrations of the first 20 years of the U.S. Constitution? Very, very few.
Probably.
And you would have been able to vote for only one of two reasons, and one was more important than the other. That you were a property owner, and that implied that you were literate. But it was you were a property owner was number one. And you had to be a male property owner. Yeah, and you had to be white. So that's historical reality. And take that forward to 2013, and how much different is it? It's messy. It's a messy business. We have a lot of people who are very literate. We have a lot of people who are not so literate. They're not really illiterate for the most part. They're semi-literate. They don't know what they're reading in our view, or why they're reading it, or what is the interpretation, the multiple interpretations of it that might be necessary. Computing has complicated that, we think, because it's of our time. And information has complicated this because it's of our time. We live in the mess we have created, therefore it seems much more urgent and pervasive to us. Perhaps it is. But I think over time, these things do, in the messiness of history, work themselves out. And the purpose of academia and the work we do is to make sure that there's a beacon, to make sure that there's a guide, to make sure that we do the kinds of education, the kind of research that allows us to have progress. And we will never have, I know this will be offensive, but we'll never have the kind of equality in the society that we would like. It's a messy business. But the purpose of education is to lead that way, and the purpose of working and computing and information is to help guide that future. Now, I say that as openly as I can.
Yes, I see 2 more questions. Are they brief? Let's have you first and then Danuta second, and then we'll end it. Thanks, y'all.
This will be a very minor detail question, unlike the great issues that have been raised before, but it's the one that occurred to me just in passing. Both of you mentioned consent as a substitute for anonymization with some doubts. It strikes me that the decision to consent to sharing information is going to be correlated with the information revealed.
Yeah.
That's what in economics we call an indigeneity problem, but what it means is that your universe of observation differs from the actual population in creating bias in unknown direction and magnitude. How can you assess the relative disadvantages of consent and anonymization and other possibilities?
So Roger, you and I had a brief conversation about this at the bar at Landmark a couple of weeks ago. It was at lunch, so we weren't actually drinking anything, you know. But he did have a beer. You know, this notion of informed consent, it's almost an oxymoron, but not quite. And so we have, when we do academic research, we have the IRBs, right? And the purpose of the IRB, from the point of view of a faculty member, is just to cause turbulence and restrictions in their research. That's the point of view of all faculty members. The point of view of the IRB, however, from the legal point of view and the reasons universities persist for regulatory reasons in having IRBs, is to protect human subjects. And the key phrase there is informed consent. And so they spend endless hours, I happen to know this by osmosis, but endless hours debating whether or not a certain wording of a certain form to a certain population that has certain characteristics is likely to be an example of informed consent. I'm not wise enough to know whether or not that is. I do agree with you, however, that in that process there are probably some very important statistical distortions built into that decision-making progress, which I think was where you were going. But better that, I guess, than anything else I can think of.
So,
Briefly, please.
okay. There's an awful lot we could talk about here about the informed consent kind of side of things. I mean, one of the problems that's emerging there fundamentally is that the IRBs like informed consent to be narrowly scoped.
Yes.
In other words, I agreed to make my data available for this specific experiment. And that's colliding now with the notion of data reuse and repurposing in various ways. And we've not sorted that out well. But I think to your other point about bias in samples and things of that nature, that is a very real issue and has always been. I actually get the sense that one of the ways we're going to start getting around that, for better or for worse, is by moving away from the notion of samples and just saying, we're just going to run the whole population, you know, one way or another. you're already seeing this this done a great deal in commerce, or you're just going to pull, you know, a big subset and see what happens. I think some, you know, for some purposes at least, this kind of rigorous analysis of sample bias may turn out to be less significant as you move into a world where it gets easier and easier to make n a very big number.
It hides many problems, at least.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. We've covered a range of topics today. Thank you all for coming for lunch, staying for our conversation, and even through the question and answer period. If I could have your time for one more moment. This takes a whole host of people to make an event like this happen. So I just want to spend out a special thanks to Bill Regley and Marie Fazio, who helped lead our committee that put this together. Brenda Sheridan, Jennifer Lawley, Carrie Bolin, Sean Quilty with the camera back there. Also the folks here at Excite, Youngwoo Kim, as well as his assistant Kara, helped as well. And just certainly lots of others. But most especially, please join me in a round of applause for Dean David Fenske and Clifford Lynch. Thank you.